Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Monday everybody. Sadly, it is not a happy time for some families in the northeast province of Heilongjiang. Yesterday, Sunday, the roof of a gym at a middle school in the province collapsed, leaving 11, mostly children, dead. An initial investigation has determined the cause to be linked to misconduct by a construction crew working on a nearby building, according to state media. A formal investigation remains ongoing. In recent weeks, we have seen several high-profile US-China visits and meetings, including Secretary of State Blinken in Indonesia with PRC top diplomat Wang Yi, Treasury Secretary Yellen in Beijing with Premier Li Qiang, U.S. climate czar John Kerry in Beijing with both Wang Yi and Li Qiang, and of course former Secretary of State centenarian Henry Kissinger, ostensibly as a private citizen, in Beijing with PRC Defense Minister Li, top diplomat Wang Yi, and General Secretary Xi Jinping himself. With all this in mind, let's begin with US-China related developments, with a special focus on statements from some of these persons. While all these meetings and the relatively warm rhetoric emanating from them is no doubt a modest net positive for the world's most important bilateral relationship, relations remain dangerously poor, and commentators warn that the next potential stress in the US-China relationship will be upcoming expanded export controls and the new confirmed U.S. transit of Taiwan Vice President and 2024 DPP presidential candidate William Lai next month in August. The Kerry trip was largely uneventful, as anticipated, with no new major commitments from either side being announced. And on the topic of climate policy, within the scope of US-China interactions, in a US-based CNN interview over the weekend, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan expressed that China needed to, quote, step up to their responsibility to reduce emissions, end quote, and, quote, should not be able to hide behind any kind of claim that they are a developing nation, end quote. Treasury Secretary Yellen, speaking to press late last week, expressed, quote, tariffs were put in place because we had concern with unfair trade practices on China's side, and our concerns with those practices remain. So perhaps over time this is an area where we could make progress. But I would say it's premature to use this as an area for de-escalation, at least at this time, end quote. On the wider Chinese economy, Yellen added, quote, I think they certainly are anxious, at a minimum, to communicate that the business environment in China is open and friendly, end quote. On this point, later in the video, we will be discussing how recent national security raids on consultancies have had very much the opposite effect. On mooted US investment restrictions, which are still being debated within the White House, Yellen expressed in an interview with US-based Bloomberg TV that restrictions would be, quote, narrowly targeted and would focus on a few sectors, in particular semiconductors, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence, end quote. Adding, quote, these would not be broad controls that would affect US investment broadly in China or, in my opinion, have a fundamental impact on affecting the investment climate for China, end quote. Some commentators have argued that China's troubled economy may push some policymakers in Beijing to promote US engagement, at least in the short term. However, other voices caution against this assumption. Da Wei, the director of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University in Beijing, for example, in an interview last week expressed that China has little incentive to make compromises with the US regardless of the broader economic issues, saying, quote, talking about the short term, like the recent thaw in relations between the US and China, I don't think the economy has much effect, end quote. While we're looking at some Chinese-based statements, we should also add, in a special commentary on Friday, state-run Xinhua expressed, quote, it's not surprising that Washington's economic approach to China has shifted from decoupling to de-risking or diversifying critical supply chains. The change in rhetoric is nothing new. just old wine in a new bottle. The intention of White House officials remains unchanged, to contain China." End quote. Now, finally, before we move on to the economy, UK-based Financial Times published a report today arguing that top US consultancies are struggling to attract business in China as Beijing's national security raids scare away local clients and global investors pull back from deal-making in the country. The financial outlet writes that, for example, management consultancy Bain is telling new China hires to wait until as late as 2025 to start their jobs, while roughly half of McKinsey's staff do not have paid client projects to work on. We remember back in May, China's state security services said that they were investigating the industry for national security reasons after they carried out raids on Bain's Shanghai office and Capvision. One junior consultant is quoted by the outlet as expressing, quote, "Being at McKinsey China feels like being on a sinking ship," end quote. 3 senior consultants at US firms said, quote, "Cross-border activity had previously been a big driver of demand, so declining foreign interest in China has resulted in less business," end quote. On that point, next up, the Chinese economy. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It is also a huge help sharing these episodes with anyone who you believe would be interested in this sort of content. This is the best way to help the channel grow and is a huge help. And for anyone who can go the extra mile and help keep China Update financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Okay, it is Monday after all, so we need to move on to the economy. Regular viewers know that things are not looking very positive for the Chinese economy. Q2 numbers across the board were poor. Youth unemployment continues to rise. The much hoped and anticipated post-zero COVID surge has already softened. The housing market is back in retreat, and local fiscal and debt issues continue to frustrate. The consensus very much is that things are not too good. But whenever there is a consensus, it is always wise to examine, from time to time, the contrarian perspectives. So for today, we will look at a recent piece by Chen Long, co-founder of Singapore-based China research platform Plenum, who argues that while China's housing market and exports are down, its consumption figures look to be improving, and there are bright spots in the renewable energy and semiconductor sectors. Chen has a nuanced, but on balance cautiously optimistic view of China's economic outlook for 2023. To end, we will examine several salient points made in his piece, titled "Regulators Unrattled Despite Weak Q2." Now quoting selected excerpts directly. Q2 data was worse than expected. The government is moving cautiously to loosen policies on the real estate market, but the possibility of a major surplus remains very low, as officials believe that a return to confidence is just a matter of time. The biggest drag on the economy is still the housing market, and things grew grimmer in June. Exports fell 13% year-on-year in June, the worst since February 2020. One relatively good piece of news is that domestic retail sales were slightly better in June, with headline growth of 3.1% year-on-year. Household consumption in general recovered faster in Q2. Nominal consumption per capita was up 11.9% year-on-year, much faster than nominal GDP growth, 4.8%. Another positive surprise is that industrial value added beat expectations with 4.4% year-on-year growth. Everything related to renewable energy remained extremely strong. Looking forward, neither the housing market nor exports are expected to rebound in the third quarter. However, consumption, especially service consumption, should keep recovering as post-COVID normalization continues. We do not think there would be a huge stimulus, despite the rumors to the contrary. Beijing only has tools to stimulate 3 major types of domestic demand: infrastructure spending, consumption, and housing. Infrastructure spending is still rising, but growth is unlikely to accelerate much more after years of advanced construction. Local governments are also facing serious debt issues. restricting them from borrowing too much for new construction. In terms of consumption, Beijing is very critical of the Western approach of cash handouts. This leaves the housing market as the only viable option for more policy support. However, we must stress that the best case outcome would be that new home sales stay flat this year at about 1.1 billion square meters. It is unrealistic to expect Beijing to deliver a big housing boom like in the old days. The primary reasons for this are structural. Changes in urbanization, demographics, and living space mean that China's new home demand has greatly fallen. Beijing still seems convinced that a more organic rebound, while slow and gradual, is better than a quick, policy-driven one. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful Monday, and I will see you all tomorrow.